The antique dealer walked into the prestigious art authentication meeting carrying 40 years of expertise in fine collectibles and the absolute certainty that his reputation as a trusted dealer to Hollywood celebrities gave him the right to fabricate provenance documentation when it served his commercial interests. What he encountered in the aftermath of his fraud would teach him that some professional boundaries exist for reasons more fundamental than traditional business ethics, and that violating them carried consequences that destroyed reputations and ended careers permanently. It was March 2004 in Beverly Hills, and distinguished antique dealer Harrison Blackwell had been systematically creating false provenance documentation for items sold to Clint Eastwood for 9 months. Believing his status as a respected antiquarian made him valuable enough to the celebrity collecting community that authenticity violations would be overlooked in favor of maintaining access to exclusive high-end acquisitions. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and like it. Blackwell was 63 years old, an antiquarian who'd built his gallery on providing authenticated historical pieces to discerning collectors who valued both rarity and documented provenance. He'd been advising Clint on Western Americana acquisitions for 7 years, sourcing everything from Civil War artifacts to frontier firearms with the kind of detailed historical documentation that serious collectors demanded. Blackwell's initial success with celebrity clients had made him one of Beverly Hills' most respected dealers in American historical artifacts, and that success had gradually convinced him that normal authentication standards didn't apply to someone who possessed such valuable access to high-profile collectors willing to pay premium prices for exclusive pieces. His approach to provenance documentation had become increasingly corrupt over time. What began as embellishing minor details in legitimate historical records had evolved into creating entirely fabricated authentication certificates, forged museum deaccession papers, and invented family collection histories that transformed common artifacts into museum-quality pieces commanding extraordinary prices. Blackwell justified this behavior as creative historical research and market expertise, convincing himself that his celebrity clients benefited from owning pieces with compelling provenance stories, even if those stories were enhanced versions of historical truth. The fraud was systematic and sophisticated. Blackwell would acquire legitimate but unremarkable Western artifacts through estate sales and auction houses, then create elaborate fictional histories connecting them to famous historical figures, significant battles, or prominent frontier families. He'd forge century-old letters, create fake museum acquisition records, and fabricate family genealogies that transformed ordinary pieces into historically significant collectibles worth 10 times their actual value. Most profitably, Blackwell had discovered that he could sell the same fictional provenance to multiple collectors by creating variations of authentication documents for similar items. A cavalry officer's sword could become 3 different historically significant weapons with 3 different but equally compelling backstories, each supported by professionally forged documentation that would fool all but the most sophisticated authentication specialists. Blackwell's justification was elaborate and self-serving. He argued that provenance was often lost to history anyway, and that his enhanced documentation filled gaps in the historical record while providing collectors with the meaningful connections to American history they were seeking. In his mind, he was preserving and enhancing historical narratives that might otherwise be forgotten while building the kind of collection provenance that enhanced his clients' appreciation for American frontier heritage. The problem with Blackwell's approach wasn't just unethical. It was fundamentally criminal, representing fraud that violated federal regulations regarding the sale of authenticated historical artifacts and constituted systematic theft through misrepresentation. He convinced himself that his expertise and celebrity connections gave him immunity from authentication standards. But he was about to discover that some violations were so serious that no amount of professional reputation could protect him from their consequences. The first crack in Blackwell's scheme appeared when Clint decided to loan several pieces from his Western collection to a museum exhibition on frontier law enforcement. The museum's authentication specialists immediately identified inconsistencies in the provenance documentation for multiple pieces, noting that forged techniques, Paper aging methods and historical references didn't match the supposed time periods of the documents. More troubling, the museum's research revealed that several items claimed to have identical historical connections to the same sheriff's department, despite coming from supposedly different sources and time periods. The authentication problems were so obvious that they suggested systematic fraud rather than occasional documentation errors. Rather than confronting Blackwell directly, Clint's legal team hired independent authentication experts to review his entire Western collection acquired through Blackwell's gallery. They also began investigating the provenance documentation for patterns that might indicate fraudulent activity across multiple acquisitions. The investigation was methodical and devastating. Within 6 weeks, authentication experts had identified fraudulent documentation for over 30 pieces in Clint's collection, representing nearly half of his acquisition from Blackwell's gallery over 7 years. The fraud was so systematic that it indicated criminal enterprise rather than occasional enhancement of legitimate historical records. More damaging to Blackwell's position, the investigation revealed that he'd been selling identical fictional provenance stories to multiple collectors, creating authentication documents for different items that claimed the same historical connections and significance. Bank records showed that he'd charged premium authenticity fees for documentation that was entirely fabricated. The confrontation came during what Blackwell believed was a routine consultation about potential new acquisitions for Clint's collection. He arrived at the ranch expecting to discuss Civil War artifacts and frontier memorabilia. Instead, he found Clint waiting with copies of the authentication report and examples of his forged documentation. "Mr. Blackwell," Clint said quietly, his voice carrying the same controlled intensity that characterized his film performances, "we need to discuss the authenticity of my collection." The words were delivered calmly, but their implication was unmistakable. Blackwell immediately understood that his documentation fraud had been discovered, but he attempted to maintain his position through the same justifications he'd used to rationalize his behavior. "Clint, I think there may be some misunderstanding about how historical authentication works in the antiquarian field. Enhancing provenance documentation and filling gaps in historical records is standard practice for creating meaningful connections between artifacts and their cultural significance." Clint placed the authentication report on the table, open to side-by-side comparisons showing identical forged signatures on supposedly different historical documents. "These aren't enhancements, Mr. Blackwell. These are fabrications that turned worthless items into expensive fraud." The evidence was comprehensive and undeniable. Blackwell realized that his carefully constructed justifications were meaningless when confronted with forensic proof of his systematic forgery, but he made one final attempt to salvage his position. "Historical authentication is an interpretive field," he said desperately. "These pieces have genuine historical value, and the documentation provides cultural context that enhances their significance for serious collectors. Sometimes market presentation requires approaches that traditional authentication doesn't fully address." Clint's response was delivered in the same quiet tone that had made him famous on screen, but with an edge that made clear this conversation was ending rather than beginning. "You forged museum letters, created fake family records, and sold me counterfeit history for 7 years. You turned my collection into a museum of lies while charging me premium prices for authenticity that didn't exist." The words hung in the air as Blackwell realized that no justification would be sufficient to explain away documented criminal fraud. His antiquarian expertise, his celebrity connections, and his supposed historical knowledge were irrelevant when weighed against clear evidence of systematic forgery and theft through misrepresentation. "We're terminating our business relationship immediately," Clint continued. "Furthermore, we'll be pursuing criminal charges for fraud and forgery and civil litigation for damages. Your activities will be reported to every authentication organization and collecting community where you maintain credentials." Blackwell sat in stunned silence as he understood the full scope of the consequences he was facing. This wasn't a client dispute or a professional disagreement. This was criminal prosecution for systematic fraud that had corrupted an entire collecting specialty. The aftermath was swift and devastating. Within 24 hours, word of Blackwell's authentication fraud had spread through the Beverly Hills antiquarian community. Other celebrity collectors who had trusted him with acquisitions began questioning whether their collections had been compromised, leading to a cascade of authenticity reviews that threatened his gallery's viability. Criminal charges for fraud, forgery, and theft through misrepresentation were filed within 3 weeks. The evidence was so comprehensive and the forgeries so systematic that Blackwell's attempts to negotiate reduced charges were immediately rejected by prosecutors who understood the scope of his criminal enterprise. The antiquarian community was shocked by both the scope of Blackwell's fraud and the systematic nature of his authentication violations. His name became synonymous with professional betrayal and criminal misconduct within the collecting world, serving as a cautionary example of how authentication fraud could destroy both individual careers and public trust in historical artifact markets. Within 8 months, Blackwell had been sentenced to 4 years in federal prison, plus substantial fines and restitution to defrauded collectors. His antiquarian business was permanently destroyed, and his conviction made him unemployable in any profession requiring trust or authentication expertise. For Clint, the resolution demonstrated his unwillingness to tolerate fraud regardless of the personal attachment to pieces he believed were historically significant. His swift action in exposing and prosecuting Blackwell's violations sent a clear message to other dealers that authentication fraud would be met with decisive legal consequences. The story became part of collecting education, taught in art history and museum studies programs as an example of how provenance fraud could destroy individual careers and damage trust in historical artifact markets. Blackwell's name became synonymous with authentication fraud and professional betrayal within the antiquarian community. The case highlighted the importance of maintaining authentication standards regardless of client status or commercial pressures. Blackwell's belief that his celebrity connections gave him the right to fabricate historical documentation was revealed to be catastrophically wrong when confronted with collectors who valued authentic history over compelling fiction. Years later, when other dealers sought to advise Clint on historical acquisitions, they did so with scrupulous attention to authentication standards and provenance verification, understanding that any fraud would be met with the same swift legal response that had destroyed Blackwell's career and reputation. The broader impact extended throughout the antiquarian community, where Blackwell's prosecution served as a permanent reminder that historical authenticity was not negotiable and that violations would be prosecuted regardless of the dealer's professional reputation or celebrity connections. The investigation that exposed Blackwell's fraud revealed the sophisticated techniques he developed for creating convincing false documentation. Federal investigators discovered that he'd invested over $50,000 in specialized equipment for aging paper, creating period-appropriate inks, and replicating 19th-century writing instruments. His forgery operation was so advanced that it included chemical treatments for simulating decades of aging and storage in specific environmental conditions. The financial scope of Blackwell's authentication fraud was staggering when revealed during criminal proceedings. Court documents showed that over 7 years, he'd sold nearly $2.3 million worth of fraudulently documented artifacts to various collectors, with Clint's acquisitions representing approximately 40% of his total fraud operation. The premium prices he charged for authenticated historical significance averaged 800% above the actual value of the underlying artifacts. More shocking to the antiquarian community was the discovery that Blackwell had been operating as part of a larger network of fraudulent dealers who shared forged documentation and coordinated their fictional provenance stories. His scheme extended beyond individual sales to include systematic corruption of historical records that affected authentication standards throughout the Western Americana collecting specialty. The psychological profile that emerged during the investigation revealed someone who had gradually lost sight of ethical boundaries through a combination of financial pressure and intellectual arrogance. Blackwell's expensive Beverly Hills gallery and investment in authentication equipment had created overhead costs that legitimate antiquarian sales couldn't support, leading him to view historical truth as a malleable commodity rather than an absolute standard for professional practice. The Federal Trade Commission launched a comprehensive investigation into fraudulent authentication practices in the antiquarian trade, using Blackwell's case as a template for identifying similar patterns of systematic forgery disguised as legitimate historical research. The investigation ultimately resulted in new federal regulations regarding provenance documentation and authentication standards for historical artifact sales. Professional authentication organizations throughout the country began implementing stricter verification protocols and requiring dealers to document their authentication methodologies in response to the systematic nature of Blackwell's fraud. The antiquarian profession recognized that his violations threatened the fundamental trust relationships that made high-end historical collecting possible. The media coverage of Blackwell's prosecution focused on the broader implications of authentication fraud for historical preservation and collecting culture. Professional publications used the case to discuss the importance of maintaining rigorous standards for historical documentation. Within the Beverly Hills antiquarian community, Blackwell's name became a cautionary reference point for discussions about client relationships and professional integrity. The gallery dissolution was traumatic for other professionals who had worked with him, finding themselves contaminated by association with fraud they had not committed. The financial recovery process was complex, with defrauded collectors pursuing litigation. Blackwell's assets were insufficient to cover damages. The educational impact extended beyond the antiquarian profession into museum studies programs, where Blackwell's case illustrated how authentication fraud could destroy careers and collecting specialties. The lasting legacy of Harrison Blackwell became his transformation from respected celebrity antiquarian to cautionary tale about confusing commercial opportunity with historical responsibility, ensuring future dealers would understand that authentication integrity was an absolute professional requirement rather than a negotiable business practice. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and leave a comment with your thoughts on the video. I always enjoy reading your feedback.